Every year, thousands of African public servants attend leadership programs. They sit in classrooms in world-class training institutions, or even virtually these days, debating ethics, strategy, and institutional transformation. They leave inspired, and then they return to work on Monday morning to institutions where decisions aren't always made in formal meeting rooms, but in corridors, where authority is fragmented and doing what you consider the right thing may quietly send you to Siberia. So the question we're asking today is, what if the typical leadership training in Africa isn't failing because leaders don't care, but because we're preparing them for systems that do not exist yet? What if the gap isn't a lack of intelligence or vision, but a mismatch between classroom lessons and lived institutional realities? In this episode, we will explore what leadership training often gets wrong, what reform-minded leaders actually face, and how leadership curricula can be redesigned if they are to produce reformers, not just well-intentioned participants. I am Chioma Njoku, Director of Programs at the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation, and this is the Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation podcast. Joining me today are two voices with deep practical insight. Dr. Fola Aina, a governance and policy expert who has advised governments and organizations across Africa. He brings evidence-based perspectives on how leadership and institutional design intersect. And my second guest, Engineer Uchechi Edosomwan, FNSE, a public servant and alumnus of the AIG Public Leaders Program. She has extensive experience navigating reforms alongside other trainees in highly constrained systems. She brings a grounded, lived perspective on what leadership looks like when systems push back. Together, they unpack what it truly takes to turn reform ambition into reality. Now is the start of a new year, and once again, budgets have been earmarked for local and international leadership training. Across Africa, substantial financial resources go into world-class programs for thousands of public servants. And yet, when they return to their public institutions, full of ideas and inspiration, they are faced with a disconnect between theory and practice. Dr. Fola, from your experience advising governments and studying public sector systems, where does the challenge really lie? Where do these training initiatives miss the mark in preparing leaders to navigate the realities of public sector transformation and helping them achieve the expected public service improvements that citizens and taxpayers want to see?
Thank you very much for having me. I think the bottom line here is that the mismatch usually is a reflection of the fact that these leadership trainings aren't necessarily in sync with the realities that public servants, for instance, in this case, experience in their day-to-day work. So a lot of times public servants have a couple of responsibilities that requires them making certain decisions on their feet, and at the same time also they are confronted with multiple challenges in the course of carrying out their work. And so these leadership trainings, unfortunately, mostly address problems at the surface level without necessarily taking into cognizance the specificities and peculiarities of some of these challenges, that aren't necessarily one size fits all across board, but in many instances, are designed in such a way that they essentially take people off guard, including public servants. So these trainings, for them to be more effective and for them to be able to guarantee their set goals and objectives, need to be more in line and in sync with the peculiarities and specificities of the challenges or problems that public servants, are having to confront on a daily basis, including, most importantly, how to navigate these problems and in such a way and manner that they're able to adapt lessons from these trainings and adopt them to specific problems as against simply approaching them from a general perspective with the assumption that, they would solve the problems in the first instance. They need to be more tailored. They need to be more specific, to the needs of some of these organizations on the one hand, but even more so generally to be able to address the peculiarities of the environment as well, where these public servants also operate and where they are meant to be able to function efficiently and effectively. Doing this would better guarantee optimal results and ensure, an improvement in the overall delivery of public service. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I think for me, the insight is clear. You used the word specificity a couple of times. So, and I see that as leadership programs often teach the what, but not the how. Leaders live inspired, but then are still underprepared for the realities they will face. Engineer Uchechi, you've worked inside these systems and have experienced them firsthand. When you see leaders who have gone through world-class training, but still struggle to make change, where do you notice the biggest gaps?
Thank you very much, Chioma, for having me on this podcast. It is well appreciated. Now back to your question. For leaders that have gone through world-class training, like the AIG Public Leaders Program, run by the Blavatnik School of Government, yet struggle to make changes when they return, I believe it's largely due to the fact that they return to systems that have been in existence for quite a while. And so things are set, and it would likely take a certain strategic skill to break through. They return to meet the same bureaucratic bottlenecks placed by those whose value is largely tied to the authority they wield, no matter how small it is. I believe they return to the same, what I call my kingdom mentality, where collaboration between departments is a Herculean task because people still see collaboration as a ground for loss of control. I would add also that they return to organizations where new ideas seem to increase the threat levels of those who did not join in the training because they feel that the trained leader has come to take their shine. They return to colleagues who have limited themselves in their thinking and are unwilling to take in new ideas because they see the leader as a competitor rather than an ally. They return to an agency where colored lenses of ethnic, religious, or political leanings are worn to view ideas, not on their own merit, but simply because of the colored lenses. And I would finally say that they return to meet people whose mindsets are resistant to change, because people rarely want to shift ground from their comfort and familiar zones and are not open to maybe another way of doing things, another way of thinking through things. So yes, the biggest gap I see is between the ideals taught in the class and what awaits the scholars when they return. Some of the things I have mentioned. The training oftentimes is not tailored to the specifics that are on ground. So the leader comes fully prepared and armed to the teeth to make a change. But I dare say for the wrong battle. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer Uchechi. I think from what you've spoken about, the insight is clear. Leadership programs often teach the ideals, what I'll call the what, but not the how of dealing with the realities that they meet in the offices. Leaders can live inspired, but then they remain underprepared for the realities they will face. So we've established that knowledge alone isn't enough. Leadership programs often give the leaders insight, but not the agility to operate within complex institutions. So I'll come back to you and ask, when you see trained leaders back in their offices, what's the gap between what they learned and what they actually face in government? So if you cannot speak to specifics, based on your personal experience, that would be helpful.
Okay. A lot of times, these trained leaders are not at the top management level because, like the public leaders program, is a certain group of people that are selected through a rigorous exercise. So most times, we are not at the top management level. We don't have the MDs and the CEOs. So the ideas must pass through approval lines, which can sometimes be quite slow, because we've gone through training. You've seen where a change can be made where it's possible to improve a system, and then you come back, but it can seem quite slow. And those line managers may have what they consider to be more important to the organization. So those ideas take the backseat, no matter how good they are. These ideas are often also not backed up by any policy because most times they are new. So it's easier for the line managers or whoever has to approve it to put it in the cooler than go through the stress of thinking strategically, either outside the box or without the box. I believe the box should be thrown out, right? And then because change, as they say, attracts more resistance than a welcome. So the trained leader comes with great excitement, high expectations, brimming with ideas, but it starts to wane as he meets maybe you come today, oh, I'm busy, can you come tomorrow? So a government ministry or department or agency, it's not an individual entity. It's not like I can just come in and make a change. All right. It's made up of stakeholders who will have a say, even if the say is on an unequal basis. And so the trained leader, like me, must learn negotiation and a high level of communication skills to get the stakeholders buy-in and even ownership. All right. So he or she must understand how to prioritize these changes, noting that change should not necessarily be a tsunami, everything just happens at once, but must be taken in small bites to be better absorbed and adopted. I'm speaking from experience. The world-class training actually must expand its curriculum to include topics with practical and hands-on scenario that would help someone like me or the trained leader to develop muscles to swim against the tide. He has to learn resilience, yes, and then develop skills that will enable him or her to navigate this somewhat difficult or tricky terrain, especially a mindset change. All right. Some of these things that need to be included are, how do I develop patience? How do I become more resilient? How am I able to negotiate better? What do I bring to the table? How do I appeal to the thinking of the top management? Flexibility, adaptation, prioritization. How do I take this in bits? Can I show how, okay, we mustn't do everything at once. Can we take it in small chunks? So that's just what I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer Uchechi. It was really interesting listening to your response to this question. I picked out 3 key things that you've spoken to, and that is regarding case studies in teaching leaders, negotiation, and effective communication skills. And I dare say these are modules that are taught in the AIG Public Leaders Program. So I want to come back to you. Can you share an example of where a leader tried to apply their training learnings, but had to then adapt in real time because, like you said, the system wouldn't let them implement a, in quotes, perfect plan? Do you have any examples you can share, either of yourself or other colleagues in government who have had to navigate it?
Well, there are many examples, but I would see if time will allow me to share 2, but I'll start with 1. I remember when my agency was transiting to e-business process, I was made the team lead, right? So we had the project execution timeline. We had everything mapped out. It was so perfect, project. This is what we're going to do this is when we're going to do that. But we had to shelve everything because we're not getting the required user adoption. It seemed as if they were not interested. Meanwhile, we're bringing a process that will make life easy or easier for them. So we had to step back. We took a break and we went into strategic meetings, and we also interviewed the supposed users now, those that we intend to use the platform we're bringing in, to find out, why are you adverse to this transition? Why are you not seeing what we're seeing? All right. So our findings led us to develop maybe a better strategy. We had to start running in-house trainings with each department to say, okay, this is what you were doing. This is what this application is going to do for you. And so that you can do the comparison yourself. And then also, we also had to bring like maybe 2 or 3 departments that had a handshake in the implementation, had to bring them into one room and walk them through this process. So we found ways to create a bond between these departments such that they saw a great need for collaboration. Remember, I had earlier said that sometimes departments view collaboration as a loss of control, but they now saw it in a better light. So we got them to own the change coming. We went further to nominate departmental champions, or we call departmental champions, who were now our voice. They are with their own colleagues. Their colleagues are used to them. So they became our voice and the process thought leaders. So we put them in front. So the people were not seeing us any longer. They were seeing their own direct colleagues, in their department. So that's where I learned the need for small bites in eating the meal called change. I learned that. A quick example I'll give, another one, is I also know a young colleague who had a fantastic idea for a mentorship scheme within a government agency. It was amazing, because it had to do with passing on knowledge and skills. It involved interactions with each department to design a mentorship form to identify mentors, mentees, the areas of subject areas that will be considered, all that. He went further to submit a proposal to the Human Resource Department because really they are the ones that should handle this because it's actually a human resource management process. Oh well, the last time I checked, he was still waiting for an approval to move a step further on that skill. So what did he do? After we had a discussion, he had to downgrade. I will call it a downgrade, not in the content rather, but in the skill, to using his own department as a test base so that the lessons learned can be used to implement the idea on a larger scale. So those are two examples that quickly come to mind. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. So back to you, Dr. Fola. You've worked alongside many public servants navigating these constraints, right? What surprises you the most about how classroom lessons meet the realities on the ground? And if you can share any experiences that come to mind, that would be great.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think for me, from my experience, engaging with public servants, especially around leadership lessons, one thing that always comes to mind and has always been a recurring pattern is the fact that a lot of times the participants feel like, yes, I'm being given very good lessons, I'm being taught, from the best of the best, but how does this help me? When push comes to shove, how am I able to apply this, to challenges that are bound to occur in the course of executing my work? So, for instance, sometimes public servants, are taught a lot of things on leadership, including integrity, including managing day-to-day tasks and assignments, and being more efficient in their communications and all of that. But then you have issues where a person might be confronted with dealing with a very difficult boss, for instance, all right, a superior. Now, and that superior has the tendency to always jeopardize, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the work of this particular public servant, on the one hand. On the other hand, public servants may also be challenged with the repeated problem of having to navigate working with colleagues that are not necessarily as vested in delivery as they are. Okay, and so as a result, while they are putting in the effort, someone else, as a result of their laxity or attitude towards work, may be drawing the rest of the team back. So despite the fact that they may have the knowledge on leadership, how do they, respond to some of these problems? And so to be able to do this efficiently and effectively, on one hand, beyond what they are being taught, they also need to know how to apply this in such a way and manner that guarantees the results that they seek. Okay, so going back to the example, for instance, of working with a boss, that might not necessarily be as forthcoming as one would expect that person to be. There's a need for patience, okay, and maintaining professionalism, ensuring proper documentation, ensuring proper records are kept, diplomacy, okay, and perhaps even skillful and tactical negotiations, okay, when relating with this particular boss. Now, these are some nuances that are specific to this particular public servant's assignment or role on a daily basis that might not necessarily be taught in a leadership program. all right, or its application in that regard. Or take, for instance, the second example where I gave about working with colleagues that might not necessarily be as driven as this person is. Again, in such instances, it's important to be able to manage expectations in this area and also know how to relate with colleagues, bringing to bear things like emotional intelligence into the workplace and ensuring that even their relationship with their colleagues doesn't come off as being antagonistic or confrontational, but as long as it's able to be harmonious in such a way that guarantees the overall goal and objective that has been set before the team. So these are some of the nuances and some of the specificities, that again, some of these leadership programs might not necessarily take into cognizance, especially when they're being delivered to public servants. Thank you.
Thank you, Fola. Leadership programs are valuable and a worthwhile investment, but only when they go beyond theoretical knowledge and immerse these leaders in the lived realities of government, helping them translate theory into action and miss all the constraints like the ones you've mentioned. Now let's talk solution. If classroom-based programs aren't closing the leadership gap, how do we redesign them so leaders can actually drive the needed transformation? Dr. Fola, what does a program that truly equips leaders to navigate complex systems and deliver change look like? I know you've mentioned something around negotiation and communication, but can you elaborate more on that?
Well, thank you very much. So again, as with every initiative that is bound to deliver on its expectations, its objectives, and its promises, I think the threshold and the starting point will be first and foremost to integrate those to whom these programs are designed for in the delivery in the first instance. Okay, so again, take for instance, you have a leadership program that talks about effective communication. All right, okay, and you're trying to teach public servants on the importance of effective communication in carrying out their day-to-day responsibilities and delivering their tasks. Now, if in the first instance those to whom this program is being designed for aren't part of the design phase, okay, they aren't part of the construction phase of this program, that program in itself is already bound for failure. So the important thing here to do as part of the solution is to make sure that even in the design of this program, feedback from previous experiences, for instance from previous cohorts or from previous participants, needs to be carefully integrated and taken even very importantly, integrated into the redesign of the program going forward. So in other words, it's not enough to set out with the program, but this program has to involve those to whom it's being delivered for in its design. Secondly, it also needs to be reviewed constantly, because again, the fact that it has been successful yesterday doesn't necessarily guarantee that it will be successful tomorrow. The times are evolving, okay, things are changing, and the workplace is becoming increasingly more dynamic every day. So again, there's a need for constant review, okay, of these processes. And even more so, a third thing also is to ensure that even the delivery of these programs involve or include in many ways specific case scenarios, okay, that aren't necessarily applicable across a general context, but more honed down to specific contexts. Okay, say for instance Nigeria. All right, so the way a leadership program would be delivered to a public servant in Nigeria might be pretty much different from how a leadership program might be delivered, for instance, to someone, say, in the United States of America, because the context is different. All right, the work expectations are different, the delivery is different. So again, these leadership programs need to be more specific, okay, to reflect the realities of the environments to which these public servants are going to be operating at. So to summarize again and to reiterate, three things that are very important. One, participants need to be part of the design process. Two, the delivery of the trainings needs to be consistently and periodically reviewed. And thirdly, the objectives and the model behind the delivery itself, behind the context of the curriculum, needs to be specific to the environment, to the local context to which these public servants are going to be operating at. I think doing this would better guarantee optimal results in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fola. So for our listeners who are involved in capacity building and leadership development space, our guest is saying all hope is not lost. You've not been wasting your time entirely. take the lessons from the previous sessions and build up to improve the curriculum that you currently use. Engineer Uchechi, how do you see these approaches that you have talked about, right, working in practice? Can a program like, in classroom, virtual, can it really teach leaders how to navigate real systemic issues? Or does that skill only come from years on the job?
Yes and no, but I would say yes, a program can teach leaders how to navigate real systems. It just requires the inclusion of topics that would allow the participant the opportunity to relieve possible and realistic scenarios. Right. I'll give some examples with the modules in the AIG Public Leaders Program. It's been a long time. 5 years, that's a long time. But we had modules on governing in times of change, pitfalls in decision making. We had some others on strengthening public organizations and integrity. I clearly remember that during the teaching on integrity, because it got me thinking. We're introduced to the need to be a fox, to recognize traps, and a lion to scare off the wolves. Now, all these topics are very good. They're fantastic. Remember, it stayed on my mind for 6 years running now. But we require more for the knowledge to sit well with the learner. All right. And the only way to really get the knowledge to be translated into skills, because what we're looking for is not just the knowledge, but the skills to be able to apply the knowledge. It's for an extension of such topics to include difficult scenarios where the learner is expected to show a good grasp of the subject matter in the way he or she delivers on the painted scenario. Like you give me a case study and say, so how would you do this? If you are in this position, what would you do? How do you navigate? These are real life scenarios. And we can also draw real life scenarios from the participant experiences. They are not coming as greenhorns. They've been in the, let me say, at least in the government circles for some years. So they're coming with some of their experiences, whether good or bad. So if real life scenarios are drawn from these experiences and we think through it, we chew it through, and solutions are preferred, the participant is better equipped, to go back and replicate when he or she returns to his place of work. So thinking about it, I would actually propose that the curriculum or maybe the delivery style, because, for example, the AIG Public Leaders Program is a top-notch program, but I would advocate maybe 40% theory and 60% discussions and tasks on real life scenarios. I should leave the program with my mind filled with so many solutions to different challenges that I may meet along the journey of being a change agent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Engineer Uchechi. Now, here's a scenario many listeners will relate to. Dr. Fola, imagine you meet a public servant here who is leading a project to improve service delivery in an agency, perhaps cutting down long wait times at a health facility, or even improving an internal process that's plagued by delays and misplaced approval documents. He has just returned from an amazing leadership training, feeling very inspired. He has the strategy in hand and is ready to implement his bullet-pointed ideas. But almost immediately, he runs into resistance. His colleagues say, "We have always done it this way." His line manager insists the timeline is pretty unrealistic. His agency cannot see the need to support his ideas financially, so no budget, and he's told to focus on more urgent tasks. Now he's unsure whether to push harder or to retreat. From the AIG Public Leaders Program, we know participants are exposed to frameworks that help them navigate resistance, address biases, and strengthen organizational effectiveness. Based on your experience facilitating the AIG PLP, what practical guidance would you give to someone in this position to maintain momentum and make real progress despite this potpourri of constraints?
Thank you. So I think here there are a couple of things such a person could bring to bear, drawing on their experiences and knowledge obtained from the AIG PLP. One thing here would be the place of communication. All right. A lot of times people have very good ideas that could transform their organizations, but the reason why they may be experiencing pushback internally is simply because they haven't been able to necessarily translate that vision, okay, that gets the organization from where it is to where it ought to be to those to whom are supposed to be running with this vision. All right. And one way to do this is simply to support, the case that they are making with evidence, so that it doesn't become a thing about themselves pushing an agenda for and being mistaken to have a personal interest in the matter, but rather when they are able to back up their communication, okay, making the case for the reforms they are trying to institute, for instance, with evidence, it's easy for those who are pushing back to now say, oh, based off on the evidence, based off on the results from other places, if we actually do adopt this initiative, then we are possibly guaranteed to also have the same result. A second thing also that might be common to most public servants in this regard is the place of budget. So a lot of times people feel like because the budget isn't available, they cannot move forward. But the advent of technology has made it such that a lot of things can be achieved, okay, in today's world without necessarily taking into cognizance, or rather without necessarily having to focus so much on the constraints from budgeting. And I'll give you a random example in this regard. So take, for instance, a proper record keeping or proper filing, okay, or even the example you gave about having to queue up, in a health facility and all of that. These are things that can be remedied simply through the use of a spreadsheet, for instance, which is in many ways is a low budget. All you need for that is just a computer, even without the internet. So you create a worksheet, you create a spreadsheet on an Excel document, and you simply tally the names accordingly and according to number, and then you mark this up, and so people only show up to the counter in accordance to how their names appear on the spreadsheet, and then you can spread this across, or you can even use bulk SMS messaging. Okay, so people get the same message about maybe a reminder, say for instance, on an appointment they have, and so they only show up in the hospital when they are due for that appointment, and not having to come to the hospital when they aren't necessarily supposed to be there, thereby elongating and also adding towards the chaos, in the hospital, for instance. So there are many ways to be innovative and creative about some of these things. Yes, this is not to downplay the place and importance of budgeting, or how the constraints that budget brings in the execution of effective initiatives. But again, it's very helpful to be able to think outside the box, okay, and do things in such a way that still guarantees the result, but even at a pilot phase. So doing something at the unit level might generate the kind of evidence that might be required to persuade management to say, okay, if this has been successful at this unit level, perhaps you can escalate this to the departmental level or adopt it at the departmental level, and then subsequently organization-wide, So doing such things is very important. And then the last point about the fact that sometimes maybe pushback around, say, maybe this is not necessarily an urgent task, that should be given the kind of, or accorded the kind of attention it requires right now. Again, one thing that's important to remember in such instances is that everything adds up, okay? Everything works together in an organization, okay? So even if something might not be necessarily accorded the kind of priority it deserves at the moment, it has the potential to stall and affect subsequent work in other aspects of the organization. So this takes me back again to the point of effective communication, okay? Such persons have a responsibility to be able to establish the linkages, to say, yes, even though you think this might not necessarily be important at the time, neglecting this or giving this a back burner attention has the potential consequence or unintended consequence of guaranteeing problems for us in the future, okay? So effective communication, drawing on the lessons of effective communication in this area is important in this regard, and also perhaps also bringing to bear storytelling. In other words, developing a narrative through a relatable story that best helps people to be able to absorb, the urgency of the matter in such a way that makes them, come on board with its execution, might also be very helpful in this instance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fola. Effective communication said over and over again. And I think for me, what I took away from your conversation is that it becomes effective when you have the right kind of data and evidence to back up that communication. That data and evidence also guides the negotiation process with the, in quotes, reform blockers. Now, these takeaways are not just for public servants. It's also a call to program managers, to trainers, and HR professionals who design leadership programs. The training curriculum only works when it's practical and grounded in the realities that the public servants face, and is also paired with opportunities to test, adapt, and learn on the job, like our guest mentioned earlier. If we want leaders who want or who can actually drive public sector transformation that improves lives, then our initiatives must reflect the complex and political environments that these participants will navigate. We need to equip leaders with the tools, insights, and confidence to navigate politics, bureaucracy, and resource constraints. That's how reform moves from idea to action. Today's conversation has been illuminating. Leadership development in Africa isn't necessarily failing because our public servants don't care. It fails when programs prepare leaders for idealized systems and not the systems that they face day to day. Our guests, Dr. Fola Aina and Engineer Uchechi Edosomwan, FNSE, have shown that effective reform leadership comes from deliberate, practical, and experiential training. Leaders who understand the systems, anticipate challenges, and adapt strategically are the ones who are capable of making meaningful change. If you're a public servant inspired by today's conversation, applications are now open for the 2026 AIG Public Leaders Program. To learn more, please visit Aig-Imoukhuede Foundation.org. Thank you for listening.